Hey folks, DusT here, and as the Perfect World Shanghai Major is now in the rearview mirror, we have the roster mania now in our sights. And Virtus.pro was the first to the finish line as far as successfully making an entire roster transaction to the team. We, of course, had heard that they were benching James pretty early on in kind of like mid-December. Then, of course, it was just announced a couple of days ago that Norbert was being benched. And while we have seen some other benchings take place out there and some other rumors kind of swirling, Virtus.pro made everything official. And so this is kind of one of the first big moves on one of the top teams, or potential top teams going into 2025. And of course, this is because Virtus.pro just signed FL4MUS from Gamer Legion and ICY from Cloud9 yesterday to make their lineup now, of course, Electronic, Fame, Flit, FL4MUS, and ICY. And as of right now, it is speculated that Electronic will be the in-game leader of this team. That would make the most sense. He has served as an IGL at different points in time for Na'Vi and Cloud9. So really the only person that has any sort of IGL experience, so it would just kind of lend itself that that's probably what's going to happen. And kind of what led to this move is just kind of a string of disappointing results for the former lineup that included James and Norbert, where James, of course, was the op IGL combo. Then Norbert was kind of an extremity player, side anchor, fulfilled a couple different roles for the team. But yeah, the team just really struggled throughout the course of the year. I mean, you kind of look, obviously Dallas, they finished in night 12, getting knocked out by Big. And then you have, things like the last fall groups where they got knocked out by Liquid and Big. Cologne, they got knocked out by Complexity and Falcons. This last season of EPL Season 20, they got knocked out by losing to Heroic and Team Liquid. Not too shabby as far as the teams they lost to, but still a pretty poor placement for what they were really hoping for. And then, of course, TWC, they weren't even able to make the offline portion of that event. They got knocked out online by OG. And then, of course, at the Perfect World Shanghai Major, while they did make it through the European RMR pretty swiftly, beating some decent teams to do so, once they were in the opening stage, they wound up losing to Made in Brazil, Big, and Wildcard to get knocked out of the tournament. So really, really disappointing results for the majority of the year. There were a couple of brighter spots, or at least decent finishes from them too, that you could throw in there. Like the Blast Spring Finals, they came top 4 and they beat Vitality to do it. Or at least that was one of the wins that they got to get them that finish, so that wasn't too bad. They also got a top 4 at the Esports World Cup, and they did beat Vitality in order to do that as well. So decent showing there, though the rest of the format of that tournament was kind of weird. And then at Rio, they placed Fix 6, and they were able to beat teams like Nanzi and Mongols, so a decent result there. But again, they were far and few in between, and really some damning results along the way. Particularly the major was a really bad one, getting knocked out at the opening stage, not even making the elimination stage, and then some of those losses being to teams that they should be able to beat when you look at the pedigree of the players that were on this roster and you look at what they were able to accomplish in the past. Because, I mean, when you really think about it, some of these guys have been stars at times, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But the other concerning thing, besides obviously just the results, was that this team just didn't have a map pool, to be honest with you. I felt like the only map that they were strong on was Mirage. They were 8-3 in their last 11 games on Mirage and had beaten some pretty decent teams on it. And by virtue of the fact that they played Vertigo, that would help them out in some pick ban situations, because there were a lot of teams out there that would have to ban Vertigo against anyone who was willing to play it. But their actual record on Vertigo wasn't really that great, if we're 100% honest with you. And then outside of that, yeah, just not so hot. Very hit or miss on Ancient, 10-14 record overall with the 5 that they had. Anubis, they didn't play it very much, 5-3 record. Didn't really look that great. I mean, they had like one good win against Vitality. They beat Complexity, which is a decent Anubis team. They beat Gamer Legion at one point. Their losses were, to a team like Na'Vi, but still just not really much of a resume to be said on Anubis. Their Dust 2 was really rough. They were 1-4 in their last 5 games and 3-9 in their last 12. So really struggling on Dust 2. Inferno, they had lost their first 3 games as a roster, and then they were pretty hit or miss since then. I mean, they had some decent wins against like Vitality and 9Z, but then, also had some disappointing showings as well. And then they didn't play Nuke. They banned Nuke, and one of the few teams to do so, honestly. Again, a lot of teams were out there like banning Vertigo. There was like maybe a team or two that banned an Ancient or Anubis. But yeah, didn't really have much of a map pool outside of the fact that they did have a pretty good Mirage. They could play Vertigo, which would scare some teams off in that regard. And then I guess their Inferno was like okay, and their Anubis was like okay, but just nothing really noteworthy. So to go along with the results, it was tough. And then when you kind of look at player performance going into this, I mean, James always had big numbers, but was questionable what type of impact he was having when he was getting those stats. And there was obviously, a lot of questioning about his IGLing, which we'll talk a little bit about more later. And he had been there the longest. I mean, he'd been there since 2019, so it had been a long time, and it seemed like, it had finally run its course is basically what I'm kind of getting at. And then, Norbert, who also gets removed from the team for this, he was solid at times. I feel like he was great in the online era whenever he was playing with teams like K23 and Simon. And it made sense for his pickup in 2022, back when VP were called Outsiders, and he joined that team, and he had a decent 2023 on that roster. But he was really on or off throughout the course of 2024. So it's kind of one of those things where, like, maybe underneath a different environment, he might have improved. But I can also understand, him being one of the ones to get removed to make room. And then Electronic and Flit were fine at times this year, but also struggled as well. Electronic really has struggled to be the type of star that he was in CSGO in Counter-Strike 2, just generally. I mean, I feel like 2021 and 2022 were his last true consistent years when he was with Navi, that he was like actually still like a fairly good star player. 2023, he had his moments, but kind of had a rough patch in the middle of the year. And then, again, just kind of on or off for 2024. But you kind of wonder how much that will matter if he's just becoming the IGL, as long as he's just decent, like, and does his role properly. Then his overall performance may not matter as much. You may not need to rely on him as a star. And so that will just kind of depend, I think. Obviously, you would still like have good fragging from the IGL slot. There are some good fragging IGLs out there. Obviously, you think of a guy like Blitz. You think of someone like Big Ozera. You think of Twist. There are even sometimes Shue and, Kixon were able to at least do good in entering, if their overall numbers weren't good. So definitely still could be, something if he's able to balance both. And then Flit had a very solid 2022 and 2023 for this squad, but he in 2024 was also kind of on and off. And you wonder how much of that, though, is kind of the team environment, potential clashes with, James about the style of the team and how things were going. And so it's really hard. And then Fame, as far as him staying on the team, I think he had a very strong 2023 for Virtus.pro. And while he, too, was kind of on and off in 2024, so was the whole team. And I think he's 21. He still has a lot of room to grow. He was a very strong pickup when they got him back in 2022, as he was also a very sharp player for K23 back in the, just after the online era, I guess you could say, of CSGO. So keeping him, I think, is good. And it's also going to probably make sense for roles, because Fame could play a lot of extremity roles. There were some maps where he would play more active spots, like kind of more in a entry or second entry position, but there were some maps where he was kind of more on the perimeter of the map, which is going to be useful for this team to try to push him probably into more of those types of spots to make rooms for Electronic, FL4MUS, and Flit. So speaking of the people who wound up getting picked up, let's start with FL4MUS. Of course, he is just 20 years old, and he is an entry rifler, I would say, definitely a very aggressive rifler. He did play a lot of star CT spots for Gamer Legion, but back when he was on Namiga, he would play some anchor roles. He had been with Gamer Legion since May of 2024. Again, played with Namiga kind of dating back into 2023 and through the early portion of this year. He was on the Spirit Academy team way back in the day, so he was kind of one of the players that came up through one of the Academy systems, and had played some small mixed teams in between, but nothing really noteworthy. Obviously, he had helped Gamer Legion have a kind of crazy Cinderella-type run at the Major. I mean, they were able to get through the European RMR, mostly beating the weaker teams to do so, like Unity, Sinners, Bet Boom. They also beat Falcons, obviously, after losing to Eclot and Vitality. So they went 0-2 in the best of ones, but then fought all the way back to make it to the opening stage. And once they got there, they beat Furia, they beat Pain, and yeah, they lost the Mongols, but they beat that Passion UA team that was giving teams a lot of trouble and looked like a really strong team, honestly, in Shanghai. And then in the elimination stage, well, they did lose to Vitality and Liquid. They had to win over Wildcard and ultimately lost to Na'Vi, who were the reigning champions and looked like the favorite to win the tournament up until they lost, of course, that damning best-of-3 against Heroic, which is for that final quarterfinal spot. So FL4MUS was a really big part of that run, by the way. I mean, he was the best player on that team, fragging-wise, after Slend. I will say he was kind of hit or miss online prior, but I just feel like that team was in such a shaky situation. Like the roster was kind of a revolving door, and the perils of online CS playing all these different cups can be kind of tricky, so it's really hard to kind of judge player performance in that type of environment. And unfortunately for Gamer Legion with FL4MUS leaving, they're going to be back to the drawing board yet again with this type of roster situation, which is kind of sad. But anyway, just to kind of give you an idea, he kind of floated around the 29% opening attempts on T-side range with the 47% success rate at both the RMRs and the Major, and he always had like a pretty high opening attempt rate, even dating back to Namiga and his online play with Gamer Legion. So I do expect him to be one of the more aggressive riflers on this team. I mean, if you kind of look at his history, when he was playing for Gamer Legion on the T side, he was playing mid on Ancient, he was playing Canal on Anubis, he was one of the mid entry type players on DusT. He would play mid and help entry on Inferno. You know, he on Mirage was kind of the guy who would come underpass and attack into connector or just be a part of the entry, because Gamer Legion were just kind of playing more of a scrappy, fast-paced style in Shanghai. And so he was kind of just one of the main guys next to Tosin, who was kind of doing a lot of the opening work on that team. Then on the CT side, he played a lot of the star roles. You know, he played mid on Ancient, he played the connector on Anubis, he played the A rotator position on DusT. He was the A anchor on Inferno was like the one map where he did anchor, and then he played Acon on Mirage, which is of course kind of like a spot where it can sometimes be the star player or it can sometimes be the IGL. You know, different teams have different philosophies on how they want to play that. I always like having a star rifler in that role, but some IGLs like being there because it allows them to kind of see more of what's going on and make better calling. So I can see both ways of it, but I prefer it that way. And then when you look at his time on Namiga, he basically played the exact same spot on Ancient, you know, playing mid, but he did play B on Anubis for Namiga at times, which is actually Norbert's position that he's leaving behind, so he could just be a one-for-one replacement right there, which is kind of nice. But they're still going to have to kind of figure out some other things, because he played DusT mid, Inferno mid, and was also very active on Mirage with Namiga as well. So really the only spot he's going to fit one-for-one coming into Virtus.pro would be Norbert's spot on Anubis on DusT. So that's like really the only thing they wouldn't really have to change going forward. Then on the CT side, he played, again, a lot of the star roles, but he did play some anchor roles on Namiga. So he was the A anchor on Ancient, which is the spot that FL4MUS plays for Virtus.pro. On Anubis, he was the B-side anchor, which is the role that Norbert plays. So he basically be a one-for-one for Norbert on Anubis is kind of what I'm getting at on both T and CT side. He was a B anchor on DusT for Namiga, which is FL4MUS spot. And then he was, again, an A anchor on Inferno when he played for Namiga, so that's Norbert's spot, so we can just take that up. And then he was an A anchor on Mirage, which is FL4MUS spot. So kind of what I'm getting at is, if you're comparing what he was doing with Gamer Legion to where Virtus.pro was at going into this roster transaction, Electronic plays both the spots that FL4MUS does on Ancient. But I have a feeling that you could probably put FL4MUS on the B ramp on Ancient, because that is a spot that some aggressive riflers can play and entry from. And so I think that you could probably keep, like, you know, FL4MUS on kind of the A extremity. You could probably keep Electronic at middle. Then you could put FL4MUS on B ramp with Flit, and I think that distributes the talent pretty well actually on the T side. It'll just come down to what they do on CT side of Ancient, because he did play either mid or A anchor, and that's either going to conflict with what FL4MUS does or what Electronic does currently. So they're going to have to kind of figure something out. Maybe he could just take the B anchor position that Norbert had on Ancient, but we'll just have to kind of see how that plays out. As far as Anubis goes, Flit plays both the spots that FL4MUS played on Anubis when it comes to, you know, playing B connector on CT side and then playing the Canal portion on the T side. But yet again, when you look at Anubis, it was the fact that FL4MUS did play B in the past, so he could probably just pick that up from Norbert and just be a one-for-one Anubis, so that shouldn't be too big of a problem. He plays a lot of the spots that Flit does on DusT on the T side, and then he kind of plays the same spot Electronic does on the CT side. So they are going to probably have to figure something out, but maybe he can just be the A anchor on DusT, which is the spot that Norbert played. Maybe FL4MUS will be fine playing that, and then they'll just have to kind of figure out the T side. Inferno, he plays the A anchor position that Norbert plays, so that should be fine. It's just going to be more about figuring out how to implement him on the T side of Inferno. I think probably your best bet is going to have Flit still being the B control player, having Electronic kind of roam between helping support B or helping support middle. Probably give FL4MUS the middle position, then you're probably going to put FL4MUS in the apartments, even though this will be a role swap for FL4MUS. But that's really just kind of the best way that I see it. And then as far as Mirage goes, I just really wouldn't want to see him taking Norbert's B anchor position on the CT side. I think that would be kind of a gross misuse of FL4MUS' talent. So I'm hoping that they can maybe give him Fame's a anchor spot or something like that. Or maybe, Electronic has to bite the bullet and play an anchor role to kind of help offset something to give FL4MUS a favorable position. So point I'm getting at is there is some one-for-one stuff that the team can do to implement FL4MUS that won't affect them too much, because there are some spots you could just take that Norbert used to play. But I think they are going to have to shuffle some other stuff around to really give FL4MUS his best shot to be a star rifler on this team, which is probably the role he's going to have to take next to Flit. Him and Flit are going to probably have to be the two heavy hitters on this team, with Fame being like a decent extremity player. If Electronic's not really going to be a star because he's IGLing, unless he's just going to be a really good fragging IGL. I don't really know. As far as IC acquisition goes, obviously a young opper from Kazakhstan, formerly of Avangard and Amcal. Only really been around the scene since late 2021. No real prior experience to the game aside from what he did on Amcal, and then obviously, joining Cloud9. Definitely is going to be a more aggressive opper than Jane. There's really no doubt about that. Particularly on the T side, is definitely going to be more aggressive. But still, when he was playing on Cloud9, Heavy God and Boomich were the main openers on that team, and Axel would also take a pretty high amount of opening duels. But that's fine. I mean, there's not a lot of oppers who are taking a crazy amount of opening duels on the T side. I mean, really the only ones I can think of is Ziwu, but that's because he uses the AK a lot and plays more of a hybrid role on T side. Same could be said for Jumbo from Passion UA, who's apparently someone that's getting targeted by some bigger teams, so you may be seeing his name kind of floated around a little bit. And then you could probably throw Ultimate's name in there as a guy who goes for a lot of openings on T side. So IC doesn't have to be that crazy, but he can be a little bit more forward. He can be a guy who's going to go for a little bit more on the T side than Jane did, so he's definitely going to be more active there. And he is also a guy who takes a solid amount of opening attempts on the CT side. He was very strong at it, very, very strong at it on Cloud9, even when they weren't having the best results at the RMR and the Major and some of the maps that they played against, like Complexity and FaZe. He would still have some good maps against those two teams, and he had some good maps against the smaller European teams and Liquid and Pain. And he would take, again, a lot of openings on CT side. They would set him up, put him in a spot to go for picks, and he was very good at it. So, again, going to be a person who's a lot more proactive, a lot more willing to go for stuff. The whole Jane time meme of saving the op all the time is not something that IC is going to really do. He's going to be looking to be kind of more of a star opper. I think he still has a lot to prove, though. We still don't really have a big sample size of what IC is capable of against like tier 1 opposition, which is what Virtus.pro is going to be playing against on a regular basis, kind of depending on where their ranking is and what events they get invited to. But I will say that based on what I have seen, he was the strongest player on that Cloud9 squad, Heavy God kind of being the other one. And he's shown me enough to be like, yeah, this is a guy worth taking a shot on in this position. So I think with the Icy thing, it's actually going to be a big move for them in a positive direction. It'll be more about, again, FL4MUS and what kind of spots they put him in, and if he's able to adapt, and if the other players that have to move for him are able to adapt, or whichever way you're going to go with that. And then I think it'll also just be, how does Electronic run this team? Like, for one, how does he implement IC as an opper? Is he able to facilitate him well? Is he able to set him up well? Is he able to let IC kind of call his shots? Is he going to have to micromanage IC because he's less experienced? What's that relationship going to be like between Electronic and IC as far as setting him up as like a star opper on this team? And then it's just about, in general, how will this team be led? The team obviously has a history of being very default-oriented, very slow-paced, very methodical, really just kind of playing default into the mid-round. This was particularly the case on maps like Ancient, Anubis, and Inferno. And in the case of Ancient and Inferno, those were two maps that were not going very well for them results-wise. Mirage, again, was really the only map that was doing well for them, which, funnily enough, was one of the few maps that Virtus.pro actually did adapt last year with Jame as the IGL, and being more willing to get away from playing default and kind of following the meta of going for more of the like 4-1 and 3-2 splits, or heavy mid control, or fast set pieces on sites. That is kind of the trend that Mirage has kind of followed lately. All the best teams in the world could play default, but they would generally have an early area of focus, whether it was like 2 players playing outside of A instead of just 1, for example, then like 3 middle, or like 1 coming underpassing the connector while you have 2 top mid and 2 working A. That would be like the closest thing to a default you would see, and everything else would be kind of more 4-1, 3-2, again, fast execs, fast site splits, things of that nature. And we did see VP do that, and then they also did just follow the metal of DusT too, but that's kind of a gimme, you know what I mean? So at the end of the day, it will come down to what can Electronic do to try to bring VP up to speed on maps like Ancient and Anubis and Inferno and try to get them looking sharper on those maps while maintaining some of their strengths on Mirage and kind of just polishing up their DusT 2 and just getting them a map pool. You know, Electronic's going to have a lot on his plate because now he is the main shot caller of this team. And again, yeah, he did have some stints as an IGL on Na'Vi and on Cloud9, but those results are very mixed feelings about how good of an IGL he truly is. This is another giant, you know, opportunity, but also a lot of responsibility. You know, you are unseating the guy who has been IGLing the squad for 6 years or so. I mean, and yeah, sure, you may argue that his style of calling got stale, it was outdated, you know, but at the same time, it is a big responsibility to take on if Electronic is indeed going to be do that. So, and he's also not only having to just learn how to IGL and call on these maps, but he's also having to learn how to implement a new, young, inexperienced operator like Icy. He's also has to figure out a way to implement FL4MUS, who also isn't that experienced, if we're honest. And again, there is some role overlap between some of the things that FL4MUS likes to do and some of the things that Electronic used to like to do, or like Flit likes to do, particularly on T sides. And then on CT side, again, there were spots that, you know, FL4MUS has played in the past that will cross over with spots that Fame is currently playing for VP. There will be spots that will cross over with what Flit and Electronic have normally played. So, again, the only real one-for-one was Anubis, where FL4MUS can just slot for Norbert's spot. And I do feel confident he probably could do the same thing on Ancient, but there's going to be some give and take on some of the other maps, and they're going to have to kind of figure that out as well. Now, don't get me wrong. It can work, you know. We have seen a team like Na'Vi implement a system where you have more aggressive guys playing the extremities and being playmakers, like what they were able to do with JL and Bit, for example, while Ema is still kind of the main entry fragger. So it can be done, just looking at that as a model. Passion UA basically did the exact same thing with, you know, Jacasmo, Zero Fix, and Chilla, like all, you know, taking a pretty equal distribution of weapon attempts on the T side, with obviously Jumbo being kind of the big aggressive hybrid. And then the other thing you have to think of is like someone like Malbs, who was a good enough player to be able to kind of adapt his roles to fit G2, to mesh alongside Nico and win a couple of titles and be a top 5 team in the world. So it can be done. And it's even kind of a similar level of experience that Malbs had going into G2 that FL4MUS has going into this team. So again, it can be done, but it's just about, is it going to come to fruition with Electronic as an IGL and with all the other moving parts? You know, that will be the question. At the end of the day, obviously VP were in a bad spot. They needed to do something. I do think that a change in leadership did make sense at some point, with just James having been around for so long, and just that passive opping style just being something that was really not it. And then if you had to kick one more person, I guess if you're choosing between, since Electronic's going to be the IGL, I think Flit's the obvious the person you had to keep. Then it was kind of between Norbert and Fame at that point. I do see a little bit more upside with Fame than Norbert. So I kind of get it from that point, though I do hope that Norbert can go somewhere else and have some success, because I don't think that he was necessarily like a huge problem in another environment. I think he can maybe thrive. And I do think that FL4MUS and Icy were certainly two really great players to get in this situation. I really do. Now, the whole thing is like we're hearing rumors about Cloud9 kind of falling apart, and maybe like Boomich and Axile go in the bet boom. So if they could have snagged Axile instead of FL4MUS, I think that could have been maybe a solid pickup, if that was perhaps an option. You still got Perfecto sitting out there. Don't know what the fuck's going on with that guy. He's just been sitting around doing nothing. So maybe Perfecto could have been more of an extremity player that would have sunk up a little bit more. I don't know if he would have sunk up directly to what Norbert was doing, but you kind of get my point. Like, I just think Perfecto is a guy who kind of could play a similar role in that scenario. So I do wonder if maybe there were some better matches available, but I think if you're looking at like CAS operas, IC probably was the one guy you could get, because you're not getting a wrinkle away from NIP. That's for damn sure. So that was kind of off the board. I'm just not really sure if there's really anyone else out there that would have made more sense in that regard. If I'm kind of thinking about it, like, you're not touching any of Spirit or Navi's players, obviously, so that kind of takes that, you know, out of the equation. And then really after that, yeah, again, like maybe if you could have gotten Axile and Boomich, that could have been a good package, because that would have brought you an IGL and also an aggressive rifler and Axile. Like, maybe that to VP could have made sense. Really, outside of that, though, I'm not sure. Quite honestly, this might have been the best they could have done. So, unless they went for one of the Passion UA players in their own right, like if they would have went for a Jumbo, who could have been a hybrid for them, replacing Jame, or Jacasmo as like a, flex rifler. So there maybe could have been some other options out there. But all in all, I do think that this will hopefully help VP out. This will hopefully be what they need to have some greener pastures in 2025. It couldn't really get much worse. They were definitely slipping down the slope. So hopefully this will kind of help them get back on track. So that's my take on this move. If you folks like this content, I'll be doing more stuff as Roster Mania continues, and, just other topics come up that make sense. I know it's been a while since I've done regular content on this channel, but this is kind of one of my first stabs at trying to do so. So let me know what you think of the content. Give me a thumbs up, a like, a subscribe, comment below, all that jazz. You know the drill, and see you on the next one.